My name is Bernadette Okonkwo. I'm 42. 5 weeks ago, I received a notice from my county's tax assessment office addressed to me as the owner of a property I did not know I owned. My parents' house. The house I grew up in. Transferred into my name, according to the recorded deed, 11 months earlier, without a single conversation with me about it, without my signature appearing anywhere that I recognized as something I had actually signed, and attached to that transfer, quietly, invisibly, until the notice arrived, a reverse mortgage my parents had taken out against the property 2 years before that, a loan that grows against the home's equity every single month it remains unpaid, and that I am now, according to the county's own records, personally responsible for as the property's titled owner. Before I tell you what I found when I pulled the actual recorded documents, and what my mother said when I finally asked her directly, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this is landing somewhere real. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the house, because you cannot understand what this transfer actually took from me without understanding what that house has meant across 4 decades to my parents. Adise and Chidi Okonkwo bought the house on Fenwick Street in 1986, 3 years before I was born, in a modest but stable neighborhood on the edge of the city, a brick 2-story with a wraparound porch that my father added himself over 2 summers, when I was small enough to remember him building it but too small to remember a version of the house without it. My father worked as a machinist for 34 years at the same manufacturing plant. My mother taught elementary school for 29 years, the last 11 of them at the school I myself had attended as a child, a specific continuity that shaped an enormous amount of how our family understood itself, rooted, stable, unmoving in the specific way that some families build their entire identity around the idea that home is not something you leave. I am an only child. This matters enormously to what follows, because there was no sibling to consult, no other family member with an equal claim or an equal stake in what happened to that house, no one to catch what I did not catch because I assumed, my entire adult life, that whatever eventually happened to my parents' property would happen through conversations I would be a part of, decisions I would be consulted on, rather than through paperwork filed quietly at the county recorder's office that I would only discover by accident. My father developed a serious cardiac condition 6 years ago, the kind that required an initial hospitalization, a lengthy recovery, and an ongoing series of medications and monitoring that, over time, produced significant medical expenses even with the insurance coverage his pension provided. I knew about the diagnosis. I knew about the hospitalization. I visited constantly during his recovery. What I did not know, what neither of my parents ever told me across the following years, was the specific financial strain his ongoing care had placed on their fixed retirement income, a strain that apparently became severe enough, roughly 4 years ago, that my parents made a decision, together, without telling me, to take out a reverse mortgage against the house on Fenwick Street. Need to explain what a reverse mortgage actually is, because understanding the mechanism is essential to understanding the specific danger of what happened next. A reverse mortgage allows homeowners, typically over the age of 62, to borrow against their home's equity without making monthly payments, with the loan balance instead growing over time, accumulating interest, until the homeowner sells the property, moves out permanently, or dies, at which point the loan becomes due in full, typically satisfied through the sale of the home. It is a legitimate financial tool for some retirees, but it is also, by its structure, a mechanism that quietly consumes a home's equity year by year, and that transforms the question of who inherits that home into a question of who inherits, alongside it, whatever debt has accumulated against it by the time the loan comes due. My parents took out the reverse mortgage 4 years ago, borrowing against a home that, at the time, according to the paperwork I eventually obtained, was valued at roughly $310,000 and was owned outright, free of any prior mortgage. The reverse mortgage initially disbursed $65,000 to cover my father's accumulated medical debt and ongoing care costs. I did not know this was happening. I found out about it only as part of the larger discovery, 5 weeks ago, that unfolded when the county notice arrived. The deed transfer itself happened 11 months ago. According to the recorded documents, my parents executed a quitclaim deed transferring the property from their joint names into my name alone, a transaction that, on its face, might look like an ordinary act of generational estate planning, parents giving their only child the family home while they're still alive to see her receive it. What made this transfer different, what made it something other than a straightforward gift, was that the reverse mortgage remained attached to the property, meaning that in transferring the deed to me, my parents had also transferred, whether they fully understood this at the time or not, the eventual obligation to resolve that loan, an obligation that grows larger every single month it remains unaddressed. Found out about all of this because of a clerical quirk in how my county handles property tax reassessment after a deed transfer, a process that generates a notice to the new titled owner roughly a year after the transfer is recorded, a notice that, in my case, had apparently been sent to an old mailing address on file, a rental apartment I had moved out of over a year earlier, and that had bounced around in some administrative limbo until the assessment office finally tracked down my current address and sent a second notice, 5 weeks ago, that actually reached me. I want to tell you what it felt like to open that letter, standing at my own mailbox on an ordinary Thursday evening. It began with a line confirming my status as the property's owner of record, referencing a recorded deed I had never seen, for a property I had never expected to legally own in any capacity separate from my parents, at any point before their deaths. I read that first line 4 times before the rest of the letter's content, an updated tax assessment reflecting the transfer, actually registered as meaning anything at all. I called my mother that same evening. I did not lead gently, because I did not yet understand enough to know what gentleness would even look like. I said, "Mom, I just received a county notice saying I own the house. What is going on?" There was a silence on her end that told me, immediately, that whatever was happening, it was not a simple administrative error that she would be able to explain away in a sentence or two. She said, "Bernadette, I think it's time we talked about some things properly, in person, not on the phone." I said, "Mom, I need at least some of this explained right now, because I am standing here holding a letter that says I own a house I didn't know I owned." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father and I transferred the house into your name last year. We should have told you at the time." "I'm sorry we didn't." I drove to my parents' house that same night, 40 minutes, most of it in a kind of suspended disbelief that I remember specifically because it felt different from ordinary anger, a kind of buzzing unreality that made the familiar roads to the house I grew up in feel unfamiliar in a way I could not quite name, and why Father was in his recliner in the living room when I arrived, thinner than the last time I'd visited, a fact I registered with a specific guilt about not having visited more recently, layered immediately on top of the larger disorientation of the evening. My mother sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done homework as a child, and she told me the story in full, the reverse mortgage 4 years ago, the accumulating balance, and then, roughly a year ago, a conversation she and my father had had with a financial advisor recommended by a friend from her old teaching days, a man who had suggested, according to my mother, that transferring the deed into my name while they continued living in the house would offer certain estate planning benefits, protecting the property from potential future medical debt claims against my parents directly, and simplifying the eventual inheritance process by removing the need for probate on the property after their deaths. Asked her, directly, whether the advisor had explained that the reverse mortgage would transfer along with the deed, meaning I would become responsible for an accumulating loan balance rather than simply receiving a house free and clear. My mother's face did something specific and difficult in that moment, a kind of dawning realization that I watched happen in real time, and she said, "Bernadette, I don't think he explained that as clearly as he should have. I thought the reverse mortgage was something your father and I were still responsible for, separately from the deed transfer. I did not understand, until you were describing it to me just now, that transferring the deed also transferred the loan obligation with it. I want to be careful here, because I think it would be easy to tell this story as a simple villain narrative, my parents deceiving me for their own benefit, and I do not believe that is an accurate account of what actually happened. What I believe happened, based on everything I learned over the following weeks, is that my parents, frightened by mounting medical costs and reaching for a solution suggested by someone they trusted, executed a transaction they did not fully understand the mechanics of, and did not tell me about beforehand, both because they were embarrassed about the underlying financial strain that had produced the need for a reverse mortgage in the first place, and because, I think, some part of both of them did not want to confront directly what the transaction actually meant for me until circumstances forced the conversation. Called the financial advisor myself. 3 days later, a man named Gregory Aldous, whose office was located in a small strip mall on the other side of the city. I want to tell you about that phone call, because it revealed something I had not expected. When I asked him directly whether he had explained to my parents that the reverse mortgage obligation would transfer along with the deed, he became notably evasive, citing client confidentiality regarding the specifics of his conversations with my parents while also, somewhat contradictorily, insisting that he always explains such transactions thoroughly and that any confusion on my parents' part must have arisen after our meetings, not during them. Retained an attorney, a careful woman named Priscilla Nwosu, who specializes in elder financial matters, who reviewed the entire transaction and told me, within our first meeting, that what had happened to my parents was, in her professional opinion, a fairly common pattern in a specific corner of the financial advisory world, advisors who recommend deed transfers to adult children as an estate planning strategy without adequately explaining, or in some cases deliberately obscuring, that any existing liens or mortgages against the property transfer along with the deed itself, leaving the receiving family member responsible for debts they may not have known existed at the time of the transfer. Priscilla explained the actual scope of what I was now facing. The reverse mortgage balance, for years after its initial disbursement, had grown from the original $65,000 to just over $91,000, accumulating interest and fees the entire time, a number that would continue growing every month the loan remained unresolved. As the titled owner of the property, I was now the party the reverse mortgage lender would look to when the loan eventually came due, which, under the terms of most reverse mortgages, occurs when the last surviving borrower on the original loan either dies or permanently vacates the property, meaning that as long as my parents continued living in the house, the loan would not yet be formally called, but the balance would continue accumulating against my inheritance in the meantime, growing larger every single month. Want to tell you about the specific conversation I had with my parents once I understood the full scope of the situation, because it was harder than the first conversation, precisely because by that point I understood enough to know exactly what had actually been done, rather than simply reacting to the shock of an unexpected letter, with both of them at that same kitchen table, on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after the initial discovery. I said, "I need you both to understand that I am not angry that you needed help managing Dad's medical costs. I am angry and hurt that a decision this significant was made about a house I grew up in, without a single conversation with me beforehand, and that I found out about it by accident, through a county tax notice that almost didn't even reach me. My father, who had said very little throughout the entire process, finally spoke. He said, "Bernadette, I think some part of your mother and me was ashamed. Ashamed that we couldn't manage my medical costs on our own, ashamed that we needed a financial maneuver we didn't fully understand just to keep the house and keep our heads above water, and I think we told ourselves that if we just handled it quietly, without making it into a big family conversation, it would somehow feel less like a failure." He said, "I see now that handling it quietly just meant handing you a mess instead of handing you a conversation, and a mess is so much harder to forgive than an honest conversation would have been, even a difficult one." I want to tell you that hearing my father say that, in his own specific plain language, did something to soften the hardest edge of my anger, not because it undid what had happened, but because it helped me understand the shape of the fear that had actually produced it, a fear rooted in pride and shame rather than in any intention to burden me unfairly. Want to walk you through what we have done in the 5 weeks since, because the resolution here required untangling several separate problems at once, legal, financial, and relational, and I think the specific shape of how we approached each one matters. Priscilla helped me formally document the entire transaction and communicate directly with the reverse mortgage lender, establishing clearly that I, as the new titled owner, intended to honor the loan's terms while my parents continued living in the house, which the lender confirmed was consistent with the loan's existing structure, meaning no immediate action was required as long as my parents remained the occupants. This gave us breathing room, a way to address the situation without an urgent deadline forcing rushed decisions. I met with a different, independent financial advisor, someone with no prior relationship to my family and no stake in whatever original transaction had produced this situation, who helped me understand my actual options going forward. We are, currently, exploring a refinancing structure that would allow me, using my own separate financial resources, to gradually pay down the reverse mortgage balance over the coming years, protecting the equity in the house rather than allowing the loan to continue consuming it unchecked, a strategy that will require real sacrifice on my part but that preserves, at the end of it, an actual asset rather than a house whose equity has been entirely eaten away by an accumulating debt by the time it eventually passes to me in full. My parents, for their part, have agreed, going forward, to a level of financial transparency with me that did not exist before this happened, a change that was difficult for all three of us to establish but that I insisted on as a condition of my willingness to take on the burden of resolving the existing situation. We now review their financial position together, quarterly, not because I am trying to control their decisions, but because I have learned, in the most difficult way possible, what happens when significant financial decisions affecting me are made in isolation, out of a well-intentioned but ultimately damaging instinct to protect me from difficult conversations rather than include me in them. Want to tell you about a specific moment, 4 weeks ago, that I think captures something important about where things stand now. My mother and I were sitting on the porch my father built, the one I remember him constructing over 2 summers when I was small, and she said, "Bernadette, I need you to know that we transferred this house to you because we love you, and because we wanted you to have it, not because we wanted to burden you." I said, "Mom, I believe that you love me. I believe the transfer came from love. But love that doesn't include honesty about what it's actually handing someone isn't as protective as it feels in the moment it's happening." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I think I understand that now in a way I didn't before this happened." I said, "I know. That's why I'm still here, doing the hard, slow work of fixing this, instead of just being angry and walking away from it. I want to talk to you directly now, wherever you are, whatever time it is." A deed transfer is not simply a gift. It is a legal transaction that can carry, attached to it invisibly unless someone specifically explains it, whatever debts, liens, or obligations already exist against the property, and the well-intentioned instinct some parents have to protect their adult children from difficult financial conversations can, without anyone intending real harm, produce exactly the kind of unexpected burden that a full, honest conversation would have prevented. If your parents, or anyone in your family, is considering transferring property of any kind to you or to anyone else, I want you to insist, gently but firmly, on being part of that conversation before it happens, not after. Ask directly whether there are any existing mortgages, liens, or loans attached to the property. Ask what happens to those obligations once the transfer is complete. The specific silence that protected my parents from an uncomfortable conversation about their financial strain is the same silence that very nearly cost me the ability to actually understand and protect an inheritance that was always meant, in their hearts if not in their handling of the paperwork, to be a gift rather than a burden. I am still working through the reverse mortgage balance. It will take years. But I am doing it with full information now, with an attorney and a financial advisor of my own choosing, and with parents who have finally, after 42 years of my life, let me all the way into the actual financial reality of our family rather than protecting me from it in ways that, however loving the intention, left me standing at my own mailbox 5 weeks ago holding a letter I did not understand about a house I did not know I owned. It is today's story on the Family Ledger. Leave a comment wherever you are watching from. Tell me what time it is, and tell me if your family has ever transferred property or made a significant financial decision without fully including everyone it would eventually affect. I read every single one. Subscribe for the next story every week. Check the description for another one I think you will connect with. Thank you for being here.